Friedrich Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3. Within this particular essay, Nietzsche turns to the question, what are ascetic ideals? And so let's look at his answer from the start. The ascetic ideal springs from the protective instinct, so the servile class, of a degenerating life which tries by all means to sustain itself and to fight for its existence, so it seeks domination, even if it's sickly and protective. Life wrestles in it and through it with death against death. The ascetic ideal is an artifice for the preservation of life, and in particular for the preservation of a weak and sickly life. So the word ascetic, just so we can point this out, is Greek in origin, which refers to askesis, meaning exercise, practice, or discipline. So there's a deep heritage in this. Now, Nietzsche is going to emphasize the spiritualization of asceticism, just as we saw the spiritualization of good and evil. We see this in terms of this practice of the ascetic. So, because the notion we see as early as Aristotle, his concept of virtue is definitely tied to the notion of an ascetic. Why? Because virtues have to be groomed. It's a discipline that develops habits of virtue. And so the individual who practices this becomes a kind of ascetic, someone who disciplines their life, and they seek the moderation of their desires, their self-control, and they obtain virtues, justice, wisdom, etc., which leads to happiness, well-being, and there's that notion, flourishing. Now, with the rise of Judeo-Christian society or culture, these ideals are spiritualized. So the ascetic ideals in this very sort of civil social sense become spiritual senses, and they lead to ideals where the ascetic is not just seeking to moderate their desires, but they're seeking abstinence, complete absence from sexual activity. They seek service, fasting, abstaining from food and prayer. And the purpose is not to flourish, but expurgation. This is the notion of catharsis in Greek, a purification or expurgation of what's impure. And so one must purge ourselves of the debt, of the sin, of guilt. And so Nietzsche sees this as an asceticism in this sense as a fundamental expression of this historical change which leads to the emergence and victory in Western culture of slave morality. So tied to this is the concept of nihilism. Spiritualized asceticism demands denial of life. And why? We're going to have to see why would that be the case. So the ascetic seeks not just a tempering of passions, but a removal to root out natural instincts, including sexual desire, the thirst for power to overcome pleonexia in the Greek. But the problem is life is passion, right? So this is, Nietzsche is saying, this is our vital instincts, this will to power. So the ascetic seeks the opposite then, is to deny life. And so this is, just so you know, this is what nihilism fundamentally means in Nietzsche. It's the denial of life-affirming desires and values. And so for Nietzsche, asceticism is, in fact, the most dangerous expression that we can see in humanity. It's the expression of what is sick and weak in human nature. And notice what he says here. The sick are man's greatest danger, not, this is a very odd statement, right? Not evil, not the beasts of prey, not those who prey upon others, but the sick. And he'll also note the idea of tending to the sick is itself a form of decline. Now, anyone familiar with Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism will see the links here in Nietzsche's thought. And again, the Nazis pick up on this and start to develop their notion of the Übermensch, the Superman, and the Nazi individuals, the German blonde, as being the greatest expression of life. So there's some dangers in this thought which lead to developments in World War II. And here's Herbert Spencer, who was an English philosopher, sociologist. He, in fact, worked out this concept of a social evolution before Darwin. So Darwin works out a naturalistic evolution, and Spencer works this socialized evolution before him. He, in fact, coins the term survival of the fittest in an essay which Darwin later appends to his work. Now, social Darwinism is taking these evolutionary concepts that we have evolving of species and applying this to groups, races, nations. In other words, that nations are in a competition for survival, just as animals. And I suppose if you take Darwinism and apply it large scale, you could kind of come to that conclusion. Of course, he comes to other conclusions which might not be so palatable. So he adds what's called a prescriptive nature to his descriptive work. Prescriptive, in other words, he prescribes norms of what we should do. And part of that is to call for the elimination of government programs to assist the poor and the inferior. And why? Because in helping the poor, we weaken ourselves. And in allowing them to die, we remove them in this struggle for survival. And this inevitably empowers the stronger classes. And again, the Nazis take up on this and they say, well, then let's extirpate those races that we don't consider to be pure and powerful. And so they attack the Jews and the Gypsies and the Polish and etc. within World War II, and this leads to genocide. So we see some roots here in these notions. So what then? Why does the ascetic deny life? Why are they annihilating these life-affirming desires? And the reason is that they want power. So the ascetic, for Nietzsche, is basically an individual who is weak and sickly and or servile and can't obtain power directly, and so they develop a strategy for obtaining power indirectly, and this becomes nihilism. If I can't have life, I will deny and destroy it. That's the basic idea. And so it's a kind of, you're obtaining a certain sense of control as a result of that. And this is what Nietzsche states: the will of the weak, asceticism is the will of the weak to represent some form of superiority, their instinct for devious paths to tyranny, which is domination, over the healthy. Why? Because if you inject asceticism into a whole culture, like Western Christian culture, for example, and those who are strong begin to submit to these ideals, well, then those who are weak obtain power over those who are strong. And such ideals further involve the struggle of the sick against the healthy. So the ascetic claims that life-denying powers are good, right? And this, as we see, is the inversion here. Life-affirming morality of the strong values are in turn bad, and again, insofar as the strong submit to these ideals and say, well, I need to expurgate myself from these impurities, these desires that I have, and inevitably the strong become weak, and the weak obtain power as a result. So it's a strategy of power. So moving on, the priestly caste again becomes a target for Nietzsche, especially within the notion of asceticism. They become the most extreme or severe example. He calls them the shepherds of the weak. The priest is the shepherd of the weak. Why? Because they're the most devious and the most cunning of ascetics, expressing it in the most extreme ways. And consequently, they are also the most ill. So the priestly is kind of the most physically ill, or in a way psychologically ill and perverse in thought and action. And priests obtain power through assertion of dominance over the weak, and this is why he makes this claim. So as Nietzsche says, the priest, the unspoken aim of the priest is dominion over the suffering in his kingdom, the kingdom of God, for example. And so notice dominion here implies power, and so the priest basically becomes the shepherd of the weak. Now, he transitions a little in that last essay toward an interesting discussion of the nature of truth and how science is built into this, and then ties his notion of the will to power and the inversion of morals and slave morality in this. Now, what's the case? Science often sees itself as operating an antithesis to religion. Why is that? It focuses on objective fact, right? Experience, observation, whereas religion focuses on feelings and belief. And here's a key notion. It seeks truth with objectivity. In other words, indifference. I seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, the scientist might say. And Nietzsche says that there's something suspicious in this. He notes that there's a common root at source when one looks into it in both science and the religious type. In other words, both science and religion have ascetic ideals at source. And so what he's going to focus on here is this objectivity and pretended cool indifference. And he'll note that not the opposite of the ascetic ideal, but rather the latest and noblest form. This becomes what science is. And he says, does this sound strange to you? And certainly this would. That should be section essay 3. So Nietzsche sees science as an expression of the aesthetic idea. The pair, science and the aesthetic ideal, rest on the same foundation, he notes. And so why is this? Look at scientists, he says. They are generally weak. They cannot obtain power directly. They seek intellectual dominance over others. And they also, which becomes the sort of aim of science, if anyone is familiar with the existentialist phenomenological philosopher of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger, he has essays discussing technology as a form of dominion over nature. And indeed, if we look at technology, what are we trying to do with it? We're trying to gain power over the world, over nature in some way, to bring it within the confines of human existence and make it palatable to us. And so what Nietzsche is saying is that in the end, this technology is the expression of this ideal of science to gain power. And he notes also there is no such thing as science without presuppositions, in other words, without assumptions. A philosophy, a faith must always be first before science, in other words, so that science can acquire from it a direction, a meaning, a limit, a method, a right to exist. In other words, science is rooted, is founded upon will to truth, which is itself founded upon a will to power. The ideal is expressed in the concepts of objectivity and difference. In other words, these are the kind of strategies that are foisted out there, the appearances that I'm seeking truth indifferently. But in fact, the scientist is seeking truth for self-serving reasons and for reasons of power, as we all do. This is Nietzsche's basic point and his starting point of his work. Some final remarks on the essay. Now, obviously, Nietzsche's work here is quite provocative and controversial. It is, as a moral theory, it can be related to what's called cultural relativism. And so it's a form of relativism. It's usually seen that way. Why? Because good and evil are relative to culture. And we see why. Because good and bad, they have specific evolving notions that change throughout society. But I think there's a realist dimension. Why? Because he ties this to a naturalistic foundation, right? He says, because good is not just, something that we make up. Rather, it's something that is natural to what we are as human beings and as animals, that we seek those things that are life-affirming and help us to flourish, and that, he says, is naturally good. And what's bad is what does the opposite, what leads to weakness, life annihilation, which is sickly. So there's a realist dimension, even in the cultural relativism, which dominates within his work. Of course, one would have to ask, let's suppose Nietzsche is right, is this ideal really a pill that we can swallow? And what would be the benefits or dangers to society in the event that we adopted a morality founded upon this will to power? So I think, looking at the consequences that come from this, we see, for example, the Nazis and etc., and those societies who adopt such views and the genocide that results from it as possible consequences of such a view.